Last year, for Parshas VaYechi, we focused our attention on Perek Mem Ches. Today, we'll start with Perek Mem Tes. Vayikra Yaakov el Bonav Vayomer Heyosvu Vagidu Lachem Eis Asher Yikra Eschem B'Achros Hayom Hikovtu Vishimu B'nei Yaakov. Jacob called for his sons and said, "Gather, and I will tell you," etc. Gather and listen. Twice, the emphasis here on Heyosvu Hikovtu, gather together. And perhaps this is an expression of the essence of Knesset Yisrael. As the Ramban points out more than once, Knesset Yisrael is made up of a totality of 12 different segments that join together and unite to form one entity. It's in effect a community of mutually exclusive ideas and attributes. There's a contradiction almost inherent in the very essence of Knesset Yisrael. There are different traits, there are different characters, and logically they exclude one or the other, and yet they integrate to form one whole. And this is so true for midos. For example, sometimes the halacha will display tenderness, kindness, flexibility, understanding, chesed, sensitivity. Other times, the halacha is very harsh, very demanding, strict, justice, no compassion. And somehow, to integrate these two seemingly contradictory midos so that there won't be misplaced mercy, there won't be extreme cruelty, any of these would inflict harm on the community as a whole. Now, Yaakov addresses each one of his 12 sons. He starts with Rouve, Bechoriata, etc. Pachas kamayim al tosa, ki olisa mishkevei avicha. He turns to Rouve, you have the restlessness of water, therefore you shall have no superiority. Al tosa. Rouve was meant to be the Bechor. He was meant to have priesthood. He was chosen for kingship, or he should have been chosen for kingship, but he wasn't. And here Yaakov harshly criticizes Rouven, Pachas kamayim, al tosa, you will not be superior. No priesthood, no kingship. And the question we want to ask is, why does Rouven deserve such harsh criticism? I mean, take a look at what he did compared to what Yehuda did. First of all, Rouven was not part of Mechiras Yosef. It was Yehuda who was the main instigator, together with Levi, of course. But Rouven didn't participate. On the contrary, he tried to save Yosef from his brothers. It was Yehuda's idea to sell Yosef as an Eved to Mitzrayim, etc. And not only that, Yehuda, who's chosen for Malchus, does not manifest exemplary behavior in the episode with Tamar. So why is Rouven so harshly criticized? When as the eldest son, he was destined for kingship and for kahuna, Malchus and kahuna. Yaakov Avinu reveals the secret here, Pachas kamayim. Had Rouven's personality been appropriate, he would have been chosen for these greatest roles in Jewish history. He was the firstborn, but he was Pachas kamayim. Pachas means unstable. It means someone who is impulsive in his actions, not well thought out, not meticulous, not careful, not planning. In a sense, like water, you pour water and it moves wildly in all directions. There's no direction. Rouven is lacking in direction. He makes decisions that are rash. And kingship, that requires deliberate action, definite, appropriate action, measured action, and sometimes under great pressure. Rouven should have protected Yosef and carried him back to his father Yaakov Avinu. Instead, he retreats, as Chazal say, into his mourning and his vidui, sackcloth. This is a critical moment. Yosef is being sold into slavery. I mean, Rouve comes back from Sako V'Taniso, and where is Yosef? He has no clue. He missed the whole point here. Where was the leadership role that Rouve should have played at that critical moment? And you talk about kahuna, priesthood. Priesthood is all about kavod, about dignity. Where is the dignity of Rouve? He moves his father's couch from one Oel to the other into his mother's Oel. I mean, that's not dignified. That's not appropriate for a leader, neither for kingship nor for kahuna. Yehuda, in contrast, he displays initiative, decisiveness, appropriate actions, and he's willing courageously to do tshuva for his misdeeds. And we see the courage of Yehuda over and over again. Of course, his glorious days, Vayigash love Yehuda, and Yehuda has an approach to the viceroy of Egypt. That's courageous. But moreover, even with respond to the mice of Tamar, Sadka Mimeni, a tremendous act of courageousness. We'll see in a minute that Yaakov is going to compare Yehuda to the lion. And then, in the critical situation of the Bnei Yaakov, during the drought, during the famine, during those 7 difficult years, it is Yehuda who's successful, and only Yehuda, in bearing upon Yaakov and convincing him that we have to go down to Mitzrayim, and we have to take Binyamin down with us. This is the initiative, the decisiveness, and the courage, leadership of Yehuda. But Rouve, it's all impulsiveness. And if Rouve is going to play a role of leadership as a king, then it might expose Klal Yisrael to a vulnerability against some sort of surprise attack. In fact, Moshe Rabbeinu in Parshat V'zos HaBracha introduces the bracha for Reuven as Yechi Reuven Val Yomos. Please God, protect Reuven from dangers that might result from his impetuousness. And Shimon v'Levi, Paskei, Achim Klei Chamas Mecheroseim. Simon and Levi are brothers, instruments of violence are their weapons. Klei Chamas Mecheroseim, instruments of violence are their weapons. As a general rule, there are no character traits that can be classified either as all good or all bad, all desirable or all the opposite. And Shimon and Levi displayed a midah of kanos, of zealotry. And they did it in an inappropriate way. I mean, we're going to see later on in Parshas Pinchas that there is such a thing as an appropriate zealotry. But to take that midah and use it inappropriately, if someone's in distress, if a community is in distress, then we need zealots, we need a Pinchas. The Chashmonoim were the greatest manifestation of zealotry. I mean, if not for the Chashmonoim, I don't know if Knesset Yisrael would still exist, would have survived. But Shimon and Levi took this tendency towards zealousness, and they didn't channel it and use it in the proper way at the proper time. So therefore, Yaakov Avinu blesses Shimon and Levi that they should take that klei chamas, that zealotry, let it remain, but use it in the appropriate time and in the appropriate context. And now we get to Yehuda in Pasuk Ches. Yehuda atoyo ducha achecha, yadcha b'yoref ayvecha, yishtachvu lecha b'nei avicha. Judah, as for you, your brothers will acknowledge you, your father's sons will prostrate themselves to you. Rashi already points out, b'nei avicha. Why does he refer to the other Shvatim as Bnei Avicha? In fact, with regard to Yitzchak, Yitzchak says Bnei Mecha. Doesn't say Bnei Avicha. But the truth is that Yitzchak had only one wife. So Bnei Mecha could be used as a term for the entire household. But Yaakov had 4 wives. And therefore, if he would have used that same term as Yitzchak, Bnei Mecha, we would not know which of the Shvatim is he referring to. Perhaps he's only referring to the children of Rachel or the children of Leah, etc., etc. Here, Yehuda was meant to be the Melech for all of Knesset Yisrael, the entire community of Israel. And therefore, Yaakov wanted to emphasize by calling it Bnei Avicha that all the Shvatim, all of Knesset Yisrael would recognize and acknowledge Yehuda as the king. And in the blessing itself, Kra Ravotz Karyeu Klavimi Kimenu. Pasuk Tes. Crouched, rested like a lion, and like a lion who will arouse him. Yehud is the son of Leah. His personality radiates power, gvura, authority, prestige, dignity. Like a lion, he's a warrior. He's relentless. Vayigash Elav Yehuda. He's ready to go to battle against the viceroy of Egypt. And the Kotzker Rebbe said something interesting, that what does it mean to compare Yehuda to the lion? A lion, even if he falls, he gets up again. And Yehuda is not only a lion when he's standing upright, but even when he falls and he makes a mistake, he rouses up like a lion. And he's self-assertive. He is full of majesty and dignity. Of course, at the Mechir of Yosef, he acted, misbehaved, he was a coward, but he rose by himself. No one helped him. He sins, in the case of Tamar, but yet he repents with a contrite heart, with sincerity and genuine. He's not embarrassed to publicly confess and admit the truth in front of all his associates and his friends. That's the warrior, that's the courageous personality, the lion personality of Yehuda. And Yaakov says, Lo Yosser Shevet mi Yehuda. Here in Pasuk Yud, the scepter shall not depart from Yehuda. And that idea of the Shevet is a manifestation, an expression of Gvura, the attribute of courageous power, self-assertiveness, to be creative, to almost transcend beyond oneself. That's Gvura. And for a king to understand and appreciate what the people are going through, he has to have gone through it himself. If he has never fought his own battle, his own internal battle, then it's very hard for him to understand the battles and the trials that his brethren and his subjects are facing. Yehuda had to experience his own trials, his own challenges, nisyonot, before he could become a king. At the very end, he undergoes a process of ethical cleansing. He cleanses himself, purifies himself, and he reaches the level where Yosef began his process. Yosef began where Yehuda ends, because Yosef was a tzaddik from birth. He was essentially a tzaddik gamur. But Yehuda wasn't so gifted. He had to face challenges, and he achieves all these goals through his own efforts, his own internal struggles. And that's a personality of a king. But there's something else I wanted to mention to you, a machlokas between the Rambam and the Ramban about this possible Yosser Shevet mi Yisrael, mi Yehuda, excuse me. And this relates to the status of the Chashmonoim. The Chashmonoim, according to the Gemara, were wiped out tragically. And the Ramban sees in that a proof that it was absolutely prohibited for the Chashmonaim to take upon themselves malchus. They were Kohanim, they came from Shevet Levi, and the Torah commands us, Lo Yasser Shevet Yehuda. They usurped the malchus, and they were punished severely because of that. The Rambam, though, in Hilchas Chanukah, seems to indicate that the Chashmonaim were not in any way guilty of taking over the malchus, because the Kohanim from Shevet Levi were in charge of Tara, of Migdash, Avodas HaMigdash, and Avodas HaMigdash is a kind of a leadership role, and it's legitimate for the Chashmonaim, according to the Rambam's perspective, to take responsibility and become the rulers of Israel, because that is just a step, an extension beyond the responsibility of the Kohanim to maintain the Kedusha of the Mikdash. So that the sovereignty of the Chashmonaim, from the Rambam's perspective, would apparently be perfectly accepted, and perhaps even necessary. Now we get to Yosef. We fast forward now here in Perek Mem Tes to Pasuk Chav Beis. Ben Parat Yosef Ben Parat Alei Ayin Benot Tzada Alei Shur. In the English translation here, a charming son is Joseph, a son charming to the eye of the women. Each one strode along to see him. Rashi here quotes a medrash, and the medrash says that this concept of the women trying to see him touches on the issue of ayin hara. And what Yaakov is saying about Yosef is that ayin hara will not have any impact on Yosef. He is impervious and he is invulnerable. What is this all about, this concept of ayin hara? Rashi says, let's see if we can just, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but looking for the main line in Rashi here. Shelo yishletu b'Yosef b'Zaro ayin hara. That's all that Rashi says. What is ayin hara about? People need recognition from others. They depend upon appreciation from others, words of appreciation. They live their lives based on what others think of them, how their accomplishments are praised. But those same people, when they're criticized, they basically fall apart. They can't take criticism. It just undermines their self-confidence. That's really what an ayin hara is all about. Ayin hara is to be critical of someone else and undermine that person's self-confidence. And basically a person who's so dependent upon the acknowledgement and the appreciation of others is very insecure and very often gets into a state of depression because he cannot take the bashings of criticism, and his psyche is so sensitive that it becomes damaged by the criticism of others. Such creativity, such efforts on the part of those who have a lack of self-confidence and they don't believe in their own abilities, and therefore they're so sensitive to criticism, they will hardly be successful. It's a Yosef personality. He's not overly concerned about his brothers. He's going to fight. He's going to bring his dreams onto the table. And he's not going to lose any self-confidence, even if his brothers criticize him. And in fact, the brothers gave him a real ayin hara, as we know. And you'll take a look at the very next pasuk of Gimel. Vayamaruhu, Vayarobu, Vayistamu, Bi'ale Chitzen. And the English translation, and they embittered him, they were numerous, and the archers were hostile to him. This is the terrible situation of Ayin Har against Yosef. They hated him because he stood out. He was different. The Greek philosophers, especially Aristotle, spoke about man who's a social animal, and he's very much influenced by the society in which he lives. He's molded by that society. He's prone to the same ways and mores of that society, because man doesn't want to be different. He doesn't want to jump out. He doesn't want to stand out and expose himself. He doesn't want to be isolated. Yosef, however, is just the opposite. He doesn't follow that rule. He stands out, and that's why the brothers hated him. They couldn't understand sheaves of wheat. Yosef was talking about a whole different kind of economy. He was talking to the brothers about preparing for a radical change. And they resented it because he was different. He was singular. He was irregular. He was strange. And they couldn't tolerate seeing things in the way that Yosef would see them, in a different way. Now, at the end of this entire set of brachos in Pasuk Chavches, Kol Eila Shiftei Yisrael Shnei Masar, and then it says V'zos Asher Dibra Lehem Avihem, etc. In the English, all these are the 12 tribes of Israel. Each man according to his own blessing, he blessed them. And the emphasis here is on the word v'zos. V'zos asher dibra lehem avim. This is what their father spoke. So Yosef bestows and grants kingship to Yehuda. As far as kahuna is concerned, it's not mentioned here. Only in v'zos habracha, when we get to Moshe, Moshe says to Levi, Tumecha v'urecha le'ish chasidecha, meaning you will wear the Urim v'Tumim. So, in effect, whereas Yosef skips the entire entity of kahuna, it's not indicated here in his blessings, that's when Moshe picks up where Yosef left off, where Yaakov left off, excuse me. And that's the word vizos. Here in Pasuk Chavches, in Parshat VaYechi, Yaakov ends with the word vizos. Moshe Rabbeinu begins his blessing with vizos, and the Medrash says that Moshe continued Yosef's blessing, and he did so by naming Levi for Shevet for Kohun. Vayvarechosam ish asher kibirchaso berach berechosam. In this very same pasuk, he blessed them, each man according to his blessing. In other words, each of Yaakov's sons of the Shvatim had his own unique, singular abilities, talents, capabilities, often unique character traits that were at the surface of it antithetical to those of their brethren of their other Shvatim. But as the Ramban indicates, all these antithetical midos operate together and they merge, integrate into Knesset Yisrael. And therefore, Yosef is going to get his bracha, but every one of the Shvat, Yaakov will bless each one of his children with their individual personality, their ingredient, their own personal recipe, so to speak, their flavor, their attitude, and their midos, their attributes. And therefore, the last blessing is Kol Eileh Shiftei Yisrael, the entire Shiftei Yisrael. Name us, it's got to be the 12. And then Yosef takes over after Yaakov finishes. And Yosef says that, what do you command me? Do you have, Father Yaakov, do you have your last will and testament? And then Kivrosi Elavosai Elamaor. And his last request was to be taken to be buried in Moras Hamachpelah. Take a look at the language in Pasuk Lamed Aleph. Shama Kavru es Avraham v'Sara Ishto. The word es appears time after time in this pasuk. They buried Abraham and his wife Sarah. Now, there's a comment in Chazal on the pasuk Ezkar es Brisi, which is in VaYikra Chaf Vav in the Parsha of the Klolos. And Chazal say, it says here, es Brisi, es Avram, es Yitzchak, es Yaakov, etc. There's a covenant here with the Avos. And the Medrash says, is there any indication here that this bris, this covenant, is with the Imahos as well? How do we know that? And Chazal derived from the extra word es. Es Brisi in that parsha at the end of VaYikra. So es is an extra word. Grammatically, it's not necessary. And Chazal always interpret es as broadening the, whatever the context is, whatever the authority is, to broaden it, to expand it. And here in this context, when we're talking about Sarah Imenu, when in effect the pasuk and the extra word v'es is indicating that the matriarchs, the imos, are included here. Sarah is an equal and indispensable partner with Avram Avinu in this bris, in the propagation of the faith of Israel. In fact, after at the beginning of Chai Sarah dies, we don't hear much from Avram. I mean, he purchases a piece of land, but that's it. The covenantal community is a pair. It's a husband and a wife that work together. Vayalui to kol avdei Paro. This is Pasuk Zayin. And all of Pharaoh's servants went up with him. In other words, to the burial of Yosef, they accompanied to the Levi. Why was there such a great admiration for Yaakov? I mean, it's hard to believe that the Muslims really appreciated the greatness of Yaakov, but they appreciated the greatness of Yosef. They were enchanted with Yosef, with his personality, his absolute genius, his dreams, and his ability to interpret dreams. And they felt that Yaakov was the father. He must be the source of all this great genius. He must be a great personality and an outstanding leader. And therefore, since they were so enchanted with the personality of Yosef, they felt the same amazing awe and respect for Yaakov, even though they couldn't appreciate Yaakov, and they didn't really have a clue what his greatness was all about. And therefore the pasuk says, "Vayalo ito kol avdei Paro." All of the servants of Paro escorted the coffin of Yaakov when it was time for burial. They had such a respect. And Vayehi amachta koved ma'od. In this pasuk test, the camp was very numerous. So again, we see another emphasis here that the Mitzrim, although they couldn't appreciate and comprehend the greatness of Yaakov, but nevertheless, they were convinced that he was a great person. You know, it's very interesting. I very often find that even ordinary people have a respect and an awe for greater people, for greatness and leadership. They certainly don't understand the nature of the leader. They're not focused or exposed to the nuances of leadership, but they're impressed. When they encounter great people, they are uplifted and awed by great people, even though they themselves are very simple. And this is an example of it right here in the Torah, because you're talking about people who were impressed by Yaakov Avinu, even though they had no clue who Yaakov was. So for those who just joined me, we are studying Perek Nun in Parshas VaYechi, and that's because until this Perek, we pretty much covered it last year. And I want to talk to you about one pasuk here, and perhaps its meaning and its significance. So we're in Perek Nun, and we're going to look at pasuk Yud. So 50, 10. This pasuk is describing the whole entourage of the Levaya of Yaakov after his death, and the pasuk emphasizes the hesped and the misped gadol v'kavid miyod. At the end of pasuk Yud, it says they conducted a very great and impressive eulogy, and then it says, this is what I want to emphasize now, Vayasli aviv evel shivas yomim, and he made for his father a mourning of 7 days. And now that I mentioned mourning, I just want to dedicate this shir tonight in as an Ili Neshama to Chaim's father. I wanted to mention his name. Chaim, could you mention his name for me? Is that
Menashe ben Chaim? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Menashe ben Chaim. And I had it written down, but
you remember. Don't worry about it. Thank you. I appreciate it.
I needed a little bit of a memory, a reminder. So we're talking about Avelus now, which is so appropriate when we speak about the loss of a father. And the Avel is Shivas Yom, 7 days. Now, you and I know that there's a concept called Shiva. The only problem is that the concept of sitting Shiva is the Rabbanan. It's a rabbinic enactment. And I'll prove it to you from the Rambam in Hilchos Avelus. The Rambam writes that on a Doraisa level, there's only 1 day of Avelus, the first day when the person passes on, which is called the Yom HaMisa, and that's the day in which, generally speaking, we bury the mess. That is Doraisa. But the 7 days of Avelus as an entity is rabbinic. It's the Rabbanan. And the question that the Rambam asked himself was, here in the Pasuk, in Chumash, it says, Vayas li aviv evel shivas yamin. If we find a source in the Torah that Avelus is 7 days, that should be a Doraisa and not a Drabbana. And here's where the Rambam formulates a very, very famous principle, Nitna Torah v'nischadcha halacha, which means that whatever we read in the Torah before Har Sinai, that does not generate obligations after Har Sinai. With Har Sinai, we start with a whole new slate. And whatever comes after Har Sinai, that's Doraisa. What came before Har Sinai is not Doraisa. Hence, there's Shivas Yomim, but it's not Doraisa. Because this Shivas Yomim is before Har Sinai, Nitna Torah v'nischadcha halacha. If we accept that principle, I have a problem. The Rambam writes in Hilchos Beis HaBechira, Hilchos Beis HaMikdash, the Rambam writes that an Avel who, Rachmana litzlan, lost one of his close relatives, is excluded from bringing a carbon for 7 days. An Avel cannot send a carbon to the Mikdash, certainly not bring it himself, for 7 days. Now, wait a second. We're dealing with a Doraisa here. The Rambam does not tell you that the Rabbanan made a takana to exclude an Avel for 7 days from sending his carbon into the Beis HaMikdash. So what do we have over here? Is Shiva D'Rabbanan or is it Doraisa? On the one hand, the Rambam invokes the principle of Nitna Torah and Ischach Halacha. We're not going to learn any halachic significance from the 7 days of Avelus for Yaakov. But on the other hand, the Rambam does derive Doraisa laws, biblical laws, for the 7 days of Avelus, and establishes as if the Shiva were Doraisa. And this apparent contradiction has bothered my mind for many, many years. How can the Rambam say that on the one hand, Avelus Doraisa is only 1 day, it's just a day of Avelus? I said, yet on the other hand, he has a Doraisa halacha of Shivas Yemei Avelus. Let me try to suggest, in my humble opinion, what's going on over here. There are 2 dimensions to Avelus. One is Isurei Avel or Nihuge Avelus, meaning an Avel is enjoined from washing his body, from wearing shoes, from various other pleasures like anointing his body. So these are Isurei Avelus, and they apply for 7 days. But there's another dimension to Avelus, and that is the Shem Avel Begavra. The person himself is an Avel. What is the significance of adding this category, this concept called Gavra Shem Avel? You know, we have various individuals in Halacha that have a status. You have a Gavra who is a Kohen or a Kohen Gadol. You have a Gavra who is a Melech. You could talk about a Talmud Chacham has a Gavra, a Dayan has a Gavra, different Shemos. But now I want to suggest that there's also a Shem Avel. It's almost like a status change. We add a word to describe this person. He is an Avel. And that is his status for 7 days. If we accept this bifurcation, this split of the 2 dimensions of Avelus, that Avelus is really 2 concepts, not just one. It looks on the surface like one concept, but really in truth, it's 2 concepts. And maybe we can reconcile the apparent contradiction in the Rambam. On a Doraisa level, we have a 7-day Gavra Shem Avel. He's an Avel for 7 days. As far as the Isurei Avel are concerned, on a biblical level, Doraisa, that's only on 1 day. The rest, the balance of the 7 days, that's a rabbinic requirement. That's already D'Rabbanan. But that's only as far as Isurei Avel. As far as Gavra Shem Avel, that extends for 7 days. And here's the nafkamina. With regard to Karbanos, an Avel is excluded from a Karban. Why? Because Avelus means Richuk. Richuk means distance from Hashem. It's Midas Hadin. Karban means Hiskarvus Hashem, coming closer to Hashem. That's why a Karban is always indicative of great simcha. Whenever you're lifnei Hashem, it's always besimcha. And therefore, as far as sending a carbon is concerned, the Gavra has a Shem Avel for 7 days. That's a Doraisa halacha. And that halacha is written right here. What the Rama means by Torah Nischach halacha is that the Surei Avel Adrabanan, with the exception of the first day. But as far as the Gavra Shem Avel, we will derive from this parsha that there's a Gavra Shem Avel Doraisa for 7 days. And then Afkamina is that he cannot send his carbon to the base of Mikdash because his Gavra Shem Avel is antithetical to a carbon and his karvus and coming close to Hashem in the base of Mikdash. And if this be the case, then perhaps we can shed a light on another issue in Hilchas Avelus. On Yontif, there's no Avelus. So, for example, an Avel who normally has to take off his shoes, he'll sit on the floor, he doesn't wash himself and bathe himself. All these restrictions are suspended on Yontif. Why is that so? And I'd like to say the following, that when the Torah says about Yontif, it is generating a Chal Shem Simcha in the Gavra. The Gavra has to be a Gavra Shel Simcha. And if he's going to be a Gavra Shel Avelus, that's antithetical to being a Gavra Shel Simcha. And therefore, if he cannot be a Gavra Shel Avelus, then there's nothing that would generate at the Rabbanon of Isurei Rechitza, Nilas Sandal, and Sicha, and so forth. Chaim, did you want to say something? Okay.
I have a question, but
Please.
Nowadays the tefillah replaces the korbanos. So if the korbanos brings you simcha closer to Hashem, so so the same thing, those tefillah, so it brings you closer to Hashem and brings you simcha. So you would think that we would not have to daven or something, but we actually had to daven, and we even have to say Kaddish. So
Right. I'll tell you why. Because you're asking an excellent question, Chaim. The answer to your question is that one of the dimensions of Avelus is Tziduk Hadin. Tziduk Hadin means that the Avel is required to accept upon himself the justice of God. Kel emunah ve'en Avel, that even though God is behind the mysterious cloud and things look very dark, and imagine just burying one of your relatives, one of your close relatives, but nevertheless, God is righteous, and that is part of Tziduk Hadin. The emphasis of tefillah on the part of an Avel, for example, we appoint an Avel as a Shliach Tzibur. Why? Why should he be the Shliach Tzibur? The answer is that's part of Tziduk Hadin. When he accepts God and he begs God to have mercy, to open up his eyes, to give him comfort and consolation, all that is part of a recognition that God is righteous. So, in a sense, there is a conflict, almost a thesis and antithesis. On the one hand, like you say, tefillah means his karvus, and an Avel doesn't feel that closeness. But on the other hand, the Avel b'dafka as a chiyuv tefillah as part of the framework of Tziduk Hadin. But I want to point out something else, which I always was fascinated with. When the Rambam talks about the 7 days of Avelus, he calls it a takana of Moshe Rabbeinu. Imagine that 7 days of Avelus dates back to the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. But in the same breath, the Rambam writes that Moshe Rabbeinu tiken lehem Yisrael shivas yimei Avelus v'shivas yimei Chasidus, and the 7 days celebrating a marriage. I was always perplexed by this combination, this integration of Avelus and Simcha, as if to say it's not coincidental that in both cases, Moshe Rabbeinu's takana was 7 days, 7 days of Avelus and 7 days of Simcha, of Simchas Chasam V'Kala. Both, I don't think you're listening. I can't see you, so I don't know. I don't know if you're there or not. Maybe it's just names. Oh, Chaim, I can see you. I don't know if oh, there's Ben. Oh, I can see Ben. Oh, Anne, how are you? That's so nice. Wow. I really appreciate it, when I could see you, because otherwise it's very hard to teach, when you see just a flat board with names on it, you don't know if there's anyone behind that. I know you have to experience it in order to really commensurate with my feelings. So again, anyone who opens their camera, I really applaud that. Getting back to our discussion here, I was amazed that the Rambam in one breath would combine these two takanos of Moshe Rabbeinu that seemed so different one from the other. On the one hand, a takana of Moshe Rabbeinu of 7 days of Avelus, mourning and grief, and on the other hand, 7 days of celebration of joy for the chas and kala, the new couple, marriage. But I came up with the following thesis, and I'd like you to hear. Both Avelus and Lahavdil Simcha, in the case of Chas V'Kana, they both emanate from the same source. Many of you know that I wrote an essay called The Lonely Man of Faith. Loneliness. Loneliness is the greatest curse that mankind faces on a psychological level in terms of his psyche. There is no greater loneliness than Avelus, when you lose Nebuch, a parent or a close relative. I don't want to talk about husband and wife. That's too difficult for me to even think about. And the greatest and most powerful aspect and dimension of Avelus is loneliness. So that what the goal of Moshe's takana of 7 days of Avelus is to give vent and expression to all that loneliness and to comfort the mourners of Israel and bring them out of that state of loneliness, comfort them, and gradually bring them back to society. Now let's talk about Simchas Chas V'Kala. The pasuk says at the beginning of the Torah, Lo tov hayos ha'adam levado, eselo ezer kedek. Levado, I would emphasize that word levado. The root of marriage, and ultimately the simcha of marriage, is two sides of a coin. Man alone is lonely. He's forsaken, he's ignored. There's no one to share his life with, no one to share his emotions with, his dreams and his future. The situation of loneliness in a case of someone who does not have a partner in life is something so psychologically catastrophic, I would say. Lo tov. It's the opposite of goodness. And therefore, the joy of marriage, like the Shivas Yimei Avelus, is geared to solidify and upgrade and intensify the end of loneliness. We now have finished with loneliness. We're no longer levada. We're v'hayu lebasar echad. We are now one union, two companions, working together, sharing ideas together, feelings together, and dreams together. That is the takon of Moshe Rabbeinu. So that a vacuum is created in a man's psyche by death of a relative. There's a vacuum in a man's personality when he's alone. Lo tov hayos adam levado. It's an existential tragedy, loneliness. And therefore, this is the reason for man's desire to marry. This is the reason for the experience of mourning and the period of simcha, of rejoicing after a wedding, is all an expression, a realization of man's desire to join with someone else. And therefore, these two takanos really emanate from the same source. And it's very interesting that the halacha requires that man should not mourn for more than 7 days. And likewise, we don't extend the celebration of Chas V'Kala beyond 7 days. The pasuk goes on to say here in Perek Nun, Vayisu oso banov artsa Canaan. Pasuk Yud Gimel. Very fascinating. The Egyptians, with all their great respect and reverence for Yaakov Avinu, but they turned back when they reached the border of Egypt, and they returned back to home. It was only the brothers who took Yaakov to burial place in Eretz Canaan. The Egyptians, on the one hand, had a tremendous respect for Yaakov Avinu, but yet their entourage would return back to Egypt when they hit the border. And that's why this pasuk says, Vayisu oso banov artsa Canaan. And then afterwards, Vayoshav Yosef Mitzrayim Rouve Chav, after the Kvura in Ma'oras HaMachpelah, in the Achuzas Kever. And it's interesting that the pasuk says, Vayisu oso banov, they carried it. The same language of the Torah, sometimes you can shed a light on a biblical verse by comparing the language to another biblical verse in a totally different context. When the Torah talks about kahas, which is one particular branch of Shevet Levi who are in charge of carrying the Aron, it says, Vayisu al ktefa. They had to carry the Aron on their shoulders, directly on their shoulders. Whereas the other parts of the Mikdash, which were transported by kahas, different families amongst the Leviim, and Merari, but when it comes to carrying the Aron, that had to be directly on the shoulders of those who bore the Aron. And here too, I get the impression that although they carried an entire entourage of men, women, and children to escort Yaakov Avinu to Canaan for burial, but when it came to the brothers, then it says, Vayisu oso banov. They carried the coffin on their shoulders, like Yaakov Avinu was the Aron that held the luchos, because Yaakov Avinu's sanctity was even greater than that of the luchos. The luchos are physical, material stone, but Yaakov Avinu is living sanctity on the highest level. It's ingrained in his body, in his sinews, in his veins, and certainly the halacha that requires carrying it on your shoulders would apply to Yaakov. And now we get to the parsha after Yaakov Avinu's burial on the return to Mitzrayim, and the brothers turn to Yosef. Pasuk Tezayin. Vayitzavu el Yosef lemar, avicha tziva lifnei moso lemar. I'll read the pasuk in English. They commanded to Joseph, your father commanded us before his death, saying, so shall you say to Yosef, please forgive me, forgive now your brother's transgression and their sin, for they did evil to you. Now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. And as we know, Rashi points it out, that we've derived from this the principle Mishanim Mipnei Shalom. The whole story was a fabrication on the part of the brothers. But I'd like to focus your attention on two phrases in the Torah. First, Avicha Tziva Lifnei Mosa. The word Tziva. It's fascinating because the word Tziva has a definite meaning, a very specific meaning. Tziva, otherwise formulated as a tzava, means a last will and testament. The brothers were telling Yosef, in so many words, that Father Yaakov's last will and testament was that you forgive the transgression. Now, when you give a tzava on your deathbed, that means this is the most important legacy, the most important thing that you could think of. Why is this the legacy of Yaakov? And I believe The answer is that Yaakov Avinu's mission in life was to create Knesset Yisrael. And Knesset Yisrael has to be made up of a unity. It's got to be 12 tribes. Nothing less will do. And if those 12 tribes cannot form and integrate Knesset Yisrael, then Yaakov Avinu has not fulfilled his mission. That he has left this earth and passed on to another world, but he did not fulfill what he was meant to fulfill, his main contribution to create Knesset Yisrael. And therefore, the brothers said that he, Father Jacob, commanded, but again, the word tzivu means it's tava. It's his last will and testament. It's the essence of his mission, the essence of his legacy is that you forgive and we can become one entity, one indivisible unity of Knesset Yisrael. But I want to point out something else. Yaakov Avinu's response to the brothers in Pasuk Yutes, Vayomer Aleim Yosef al Tiro, Ki hasachas Elokim ani. Am I in the place of God? What's going on over here? Very unusual kind of expression coming out of the mouth of Yosef. Hataras Elokim ani. And we find something similar with Yaakov and Rachel, but there's a lot that has to be understood in that context as well. But I believe there are two fundamental ideas that are behind the scenes, below the surface here in Atachas Elokim An. Let's take a careful look at the message the brothers sent to Yosef in Pasuk Yud Zayin. Ana Sana Pesha Achecha. Again, the translation here is a loose translation. It's not going to give us what I want to say, but forgive the transgressions of the servants of God. We find this phrase sana in a different context, and that is the vidui of the Kohen Gadol and Yom HaKippur. Sana, kaperna, those words are words of vidu. Now let's understand, there are two concepts that are fundamentally different. One is vidui, and one is bakashas mechila. In the case of Bein Adam L'Makal, when a human being stands in front of the Almighty, his responsibility, his obligation is vidu. And in vidu, he asks for the Almighty to wipe away his sins, to atone for his sins, to clear his record. Sana, kaperna, those words are appropriate when man stands in front of and in the presence of God and he recites vidu. Those words are inappropriate when man stands in front of fellow man and he has done wrong to his fellow man and he's asking for mechila. He's obligated to ask for mechila, but not sana, not kaperna. And therefore Yosef's response is hatachas elokim ani. You really have crossed all bounds here. You're using language that is indicative of vidu. That's not appropriate for bakashas mechila. When man wrongs fellow man, it's not vidu that he's required to do. Vidu means self-indictment. Vidu means, God, everything you did to me and all my parts, that's all 100% just. I was totally in the wrong. That's not a language that's appropriate for bakashas mechila, for a sinner to say, I was totally, completely wrong. In every dispute between man and fellow man, we don't use language of vidu, this absolute I am completely wrong. That's not what Mechila is all about. Mechila means I'm asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to please restore our friendship. And that's what Yosef had expected his brothers to do. Makash Mechila, that would have been appropriate. But Atachas Elokim, you're addressing me using the language of Vidu, which is only appropriate in front of God. But I think there's another idea here below the surface in Yosef's response, Hatachas Elokim. There are two systems of judgment and punishment. One is Bidei Shamayim, and the other is Bidei Bezdin. Let me give you an example to demonstrate this fundamental distinction. The Torah says, excuse me, in a parsha of injury, when man wounds another man, ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye. Chazal, in Torah Shebal Peh, interpreted to mean mama. It means financial compensation. We do not take out the eye of the oppressor, just like the victim lost his eye. But why then does the Torah use this ambiguous language of ayin tachas ayin? A language that misleads us into believing that we should kaviyachol take out the eye of the mazik, of the chovel, for causing the loss of the eye of the nechbal, of the victim. And the answer, I believe, is the following. In truth, in a world of pure justice, where the victim is suffering the excruciating experience of losing an eye, which can't even imagine what it is, it's unspeakable, there is no justice without taking out the eye of the chovel, of the attacker. But that's in the ideal world of justice. But in this world of a human court, we can't reach up to that level of ayin tachas ayin. We have to reinterpret it to mean monetary compensation. The brothers are saying to Yosef that we really deserve slavery, just like we sold you into slavery, years and years of slavery. And Yosef's response is, Hatachas Elokim anov. You may be right. Ayin tachas ayin. Really, in pure justice terms, you deserve years and years of slavery because that's what you imposed upon me. But Yosef says that that kind of punishment, that kind of vengeance, can only be exacted by God. Hatachas Elokim anov. On a juridic level of Bezdin, the halacha precludes that vengeance of ayin tachas ayin. I would like to take a few minutes' time to speak about this concept of bakashas mechila, asking for forgiveness from fellow man, which is so central here in this parsha, in Parshas VaYechi, in the aftermath of Mechiras Yosef and on the way back from the burial of Yaakov. You know that there's a chapter in Bava Kama called Perek HaChovel, which deals with physical attacks and wounds that Rouve imposed upon Shimon. And the Mishnah says that there's no atonement for such a chavola ad sheyevakesh mimenu mechila. Ad sheyevakesh mimenu mechila. Has to ask for forgiveness. And the Mishnah derives it from a pasuk that reads, Hashev Eishes Ha'ish V'Spalel Ba'adecha. Now, At the end of Yuma, Masechta Yoma, the Mishnah says, Avero shebein Adam lechavero, ein Yom HaKippurim mechaper, but Lifnei Hashem titaru only applies to bein Adam l'mach. Yom Kippur cannot be mechaper. Then it says the following: Ad sheyafayes es chavero. Wait a minute. The Mishnah in Bava Kama in Perek HaChovel said Ad sheyavakish mimenu mechila. Watch the language carefully. You have to ask for forgiveness and pardon. Here in Yuma, it's Ad sheyafayes es chavero. Or the way the Mishnah has it, at Shiratzes Chavera. What's the difference between Bakashas Mechila and Yiratze Es Chavero or Yefayes Es Chavero? Bakashas Mechila means I beg your pardon. That's it. But Yefayes Es Chavero is much more profound. It's much more far-reaching. Yefayes Es Chavero means that we have to become chaverim. We have to restore the original yedidus, that close relationship that we once had. L'ratos Es Chavero. It's not enough to be mavakesh mechila. Mavakesh mechila is really a concept that belongs to kosher mishpat, to the laws of monetary. I owe you a chov, and I ask you to wipe off the chov. Pardon me from the chov. But now we're talking about something much more profound. Ad sheyiratzes chavera. How do I reconcile? And the answer, I believe, is that Bakoshas Mechila applies the whole year round. But that's not sufficient on Yom Kippur. The Mishnah Yuma is telling us that Ein Yom Kippurim mechaper al averos bein adam lechavero ad sheyiratzes chavero. If you want the kapara of Yom Kippurim, it's not enough to have Bakoshas Mechila. That won't suffice. That won't do it. That won't cut the mustard. You need Yiritza Yes Chavero. And why? Why are the standards of and the requirements, conditions to achieve Kaparas Yom Kippurim so much higher and so much more demanding than the rest of the year? And the answer, I believe, is because, as the Python describes it, Yom Kippurim hu Yom Chiba V'Reus. That's what we say in the Seder Avodah. It's a very famous piyut. Why? Yom Chiba V'Reus. And the answer, I believe, lies in the word Tzom. The Rambam calls Yom Kippurim Yom HaTzom. What does the word Tzom mean? I know, you're going to tell me, I'll prove it to you. It means fasting, right? Because that's what it says in Artzka, right? But that's not what Tzom means. Tzom is Milashon Tzama. Do you know what a Tzama is? Is there anyone here today? Again, I don't know who's here today. I only see Chaim. So I can only address this question to Chaim. Everybody else is just something flat on the screen, 2-dimensional. Oh, now I see Ben. I'm going to ask Chaim and Ben again if Chaim number 2 or Ann or Chaim number 3. If anybody wants to open up their cameras and we can see each other face to face, I'll address this question to you. But right now I don't see anybody, so I'm assuming you're doing your laundry or whatever you're doing. So I'm going to just address Chaim and Ben. And I'm going to ask you the following question. What is Tzadi Mem Hey?
It's a braid.
Excellent.
Thirst.
A braid. What Yom Kippurim is about is a tzama. It's a braid. We have to be braided together. Like the Gemara says about the Ketores. The Chelbana had to be integrated into the Ketores, even though it was Reicho Ra. We need all of Klal Yisrael coming as one entity for the kapara, to achieve the kapara of Yom Kippurim. It's a Yom Tzom. We need to be braided. We need to, as we say on Nilel Kol Nidri night, lahatir lispalim avyonim. We have to get all together. And therefore, with regard to Yom Kippurim, it's not enough just to ask for mechila, but rather the halacha says, you want to come for kapara, don't come as a yochid, as an individual. You have to come as a part of the klal. And in order to reinstate yourself into the klal, we need a yom yom chiba v'reus. We need summer. We need braided together, all of one. Achiyaratza yifayis es kavero, to reinstate that tremendous closeness. And in Pasuk Chaf Gimel, Vayar Yosef Lephraim B'nei Shilesh. Joseph saw children, a third generation born to Ephraim. You know what I think? That Yosef is learning from his father, but he's even surpassing his father. The greatness of Yaakov is that he blessed Ephraim and Menashe. Ephraim first, actually, on the right side. Why? Because Yaakov, in his 17 years at the end of his life, had a close relationship with his grandchildren. Chazal say he taught them Torah. Why does that make Yaakov so great? Because that's what the Masorah is all about. Masorah, the transmission of Torah, means not just to transmit the Torah to your sons, but transmit it to your grandchildren. And the Gemara tells us, I believe it's Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, that Kol Malamed is ben beno Torah, malalav akasav kilu kiblo me'archore. There's a great element of Masorah when a grandfather learns Torah with his grandson. That's why Yaakov Avinu is called a Zakeh. Zakeh means a grandfather, not just an elder. Yaakov teaches his grandchildren. We don't know that Avram taught Yaakov. We don't know that Yitzchak taught the children of Yaakov. But we know that Yaakov taught the children of Yosef. And that makes him the paradigm of Masorah HaTorah. He who teaches his grandson Torah is considered as if he received the Torah from Har Sinai. Although the Rambam paskins, by the way, at the beginning of Hilchos Talmud Torah, that one has a greater responsibility to teach his children than his grandchildren, and that's true on a halachic level. But as far as the Masorah and the transmission of Torah is concerned, as Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says it, the grandchildren take precedence over the children. And here, Vayar Yosef Lephraim b'nei Shilesh. Yosef is blessing not just his children, and not just his children's children, but his children's grandchildren. And that's b'nei Ephraim b'nei Shilesh. So Yosef is adding another generation above and beyond Yaakov. And then the pasuk says, Gam b'nei Machir ben Menashe yuldu al birkei Yosef. There was a special relationship between Yosef and b'nei Machir ben Menashe. So Menashe is the son of Yosef. Machir is the grandson of Yosef. And B'nai Machir are the great-grandchildren of Yosef. And it means that he taught Torah to his great-grandchildren. One up it on Yaakov. And it's so amazing to me. You know, I live in a generation where there's so much discussion about the so-called generation gap, you know, between father and children. But in Torah, in the transmission of Torah, the Masorah HaTorah, there ain't no such thing as a generation gap. And the children and the grandchildren and even the great-grandchildren appreciate the Masorah HaTorah going through generations. We speak one language. I come into class to teach Torah. Thank God I'm in my advanced years. I'm already 83. And I'm sitting with boys who are young, robust. Some of them have just turned 20. The older ones are 25 and over. And yet there's no gap. I mean, we communicate. We all speak the same language. We share the same Torah, the same ideals, the same ideas. And this is, I think, what's being emphasized here, the transmission of the Masorah. All of these ideas really come back to the concept of Knesset Yisrael as one entity. I want to speak to you a little bit about this idea of a community. And I've written about it in a number of different essays. Tonight, I'll just highlight 2 points. First of all, the idea of mutual responsibility. We join a community together and we feel an obligation of mutual responsibility. You know that Rabbi Yisrael Lifkin was the founder of the Mussar movement. I recently gave a lecture about his legacy. And the truth is that when he sent his messengers to the yeshiva of my grandfather at that time in Volozhin, Reb Chaim was lukewarm and was not excited about introducing the study of Mussar into the yeshiva world. However, what was the message of Rabbi Yisrael? And it was so phenomenal, so fundamental. It's mutual responsibility. We're all part of one entity. Knesset Yisrael. We form a community. And the moment I recognize what Martin Buber would say, I vow, I recognize this vow, I recognize my responsibility of Kol Yisrael, HaRav Zebes. And Rabbi Yisrael taught that sensitivity. What are the needs of others? Don't be focused only on your own needs. Ask yourself, investigate, what are the needs of someone else? How can you help him out? Maybe he needs an invite for a Shabbos meal. Maybe he needs a word of encouragement. And in a certain sense, Bonim Atem L'Hashem Elokechem, our relationship one to the other is like God's relationship to us, which is a relationship of a father to the son. And just like a father has to be a best friend to his son, and he has to encourage his son and feel a sense of responsibility, so too, when we form a community and we feel mutually responsible. And I want to take this one step further, and that's tefillah, and that's prayer. A community means, and I'm quoting myself here, a community of common pain, of common suffering. And Allah has taught the individual to include his fellow man in his prayer. The individual must not limit himself to his own needs, no matter how pressing these needs are, nor how distinguished he is. The Allah has formulated prayer in the plural. There is hardly a prayer which avails itself of the grammatical singular. Even private prayers, those offered on the occasion of nebuch, sickness, death, or other crises, are recited in the plural. Shetishlach refuah shleima l'shamayim b'toch shar choli Yisrael. Hamokim yinachem eschem b'soch shar avele Sion v'Yushalayim. Whatever a person's needs are, prayer is not confined to the individual. So we classify prayer classically as ben adam l'makom, but prayer is ben adam l'chavero. Prayer is something that I engage in on behalf of all the members of my community. and therefore it's been Adam L'Chavera. And most important, as we discussed earlier, is to banish loneliness, which is the greatest crisis in man's life. And that's what a community is all about. I know it's getting late. I want to conclude with Pasuk Chaf He, here in Perek Nun. Vayeshaba Yosef es bnei Yisrael lemor pakod yifkod elokim eschem vehalisem es atzmotzai mizeh. And Joseph adjured, which means mashpia, he adjured the children of Israel, saying, God will surely remember you, and you shall take up my bones out of here. There's a certain element in this particular episode of irony, almost embarrassing to Yosef. Yosef is the viceroy of the greatest nation in the entire civilized world. He's on the top of the top. And yet, in this particular passage and this episode, he has to, so to speak, beg on all fours. After he dies, he has no control of where he will be buried. And he's desperately trying to invoke the promise, the guarantee, the commitment of his brothers to take his remains and not bury him in Mitzrayim, but bring them back to Eretz Canaan. Here is the viceroy of the greatest civilization, the greatest nation, the ruler, and yet just a small gesture like taking his bones to bury. He's got to beg his brothers to do so. He's powerless. But I want to go beyond this. The issue of burial goes way beyond just, I like to be buried. You'll hear it today very often. I want to be buried in Eretz Yisrael. Take my remains after I die to Eretz Yisrael. I have a lot to say about that, but not for now. But in the case of Yosef, I believe that this concept of valosi, valisem es hasmosai mizeh, valisem, let's emphasize that word. I think it has much more profound meaning, valisem, to bring it up. What does that mean? The greatest and most important goal in Yosef's life, his greatest desire, his prayer and his hope, was to be reinstated amongst the Shvatim of Yisrael, to assume his place amongst the 12 tribes of Israel. In the case of the Choshen, that Yosef's stone would be etched beside all the other stones on the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol. And to achieve this goal, Yosef would have to be buried in Eretz Canaan. Had Yosef been buried in Eretz Mitzrayim, it would have meant that he would not be able to be he would not be able to assume his role together with all the other Shvatim. And what that means is, again, as we said earlier, the mission of Yaakov Avinu to create Knesset Yisrael would have been a failure, a flop. And so the word v'ha'alisem es hasmotzai has a double meaning. On the one hand, it means don't leave my remains in Mitzrayim, but on the other hand, v'ha'alisem means to elevate me, to elevate my standing. I was estranged by my brothers, by the Shvatim. I was hated by my brothers. What we need desperately is a spiritual realignment of Yosef with the rest of Klal Yisrael. And I think this would answer the famous question of the Mefarshim: why didn't Yosef implore his own sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, to bury him in Eretz Canaan? Why does he turn instead to his brothers? But the answer is, he wasn't just concerned about finding a final resting place. He was concerned about his very legacy, his very position. He was estranged by the family. Would they realign him and re-accept him and create the ultimate Knesset Yisrael? And for this, Yosef had to repair the breach in their relationship. He had to, again, as we spoke about before, leratzos es chavero, lefayos es chavero, to somehow take that strained relationship from the early childhood and inculcate into it respect, mutual love, where previously there was just distress, hatred, distrust, fear, suspicion. And so that now he is giving his brothers the job to redefine Klal Yisrael, Knesset Yisrael, to redeem him and reinstate him amongst his brothers. And what this means is that, in a sense, Yosef is now doing the exact antithesis of what his dreams were all about. His dreams were all about the brothers bowing down to him, but now he's got to beg from his brothers. He's totally lost. He's totally dependent on his brothers for his own personal redemption. And it's fascinating. The Medrash says, and with this we'll conclude tonight, that it was Moshe Rabbeinu himself who was dedicated to the task of searching for the coffin of Yosef at the moment of Yetzias Mitzrayim, to bring Yosef's remains with him. This Moshe Rabbeinu defined as a spiritual mission in order to guarantee the Jewish commitment to God and his mitzvos in exile, in the great exile of Mitzrayim. Why was it that Yosef had to be brought? Why was Moshe Rabbeinu involving himself personally in looking for Yosef, his remains? Because Yosef is paradigmic of the Jew who successfully endures Golus and whose commitment is unaffected. He's not swerved by the society around him. He is totally dedicated to God, even in the most adverse environment of the society of exile. And therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu himself understood that we need Yosef with us, because Yosef demonstrated the adherence to the precepts of the Torah. And in every state, whether it's in poverty or slavery, whether it's in the royal garb of the ruling viceroy of Mitzrayim, we need Yosef as the precedent, as the primary example that we can emulate a Yosef when we go down to Mitzrayim and we experience the exile. And it's really amazing that when we talk about Shimon Levi, and we spoke about their instruments of violence, if you remember, we discussed in Perek Memtes, those who were with me earlier. Levi was really the biggest bar plugta, the dissenter, the scoffer of Yosef amongst all the brothers. Levi was the enemy, so to speak, of Yosef. And Chazal tell us that Moshe, as a descendant of Levi, had to rectify the sin of Levi. In a sense, it's almost as if vicariously Levi acknowledged his mistake. And the Gemara says in Masechta Sota that Moshe Rabbeinu not only took the bones of Yosef with him, but he was with him together in one abode, which means that he was not just physically carrying Yosef's coffin, but he was carrying and internalizing Yosef's legacy. And Moshe was basically acknowledging and stating and teaching that the entire nation of Israel owes gratitude, everlasting gratitude to Yosef, not only for their physical well-being, which certainly Yosef helped sustain, he sustained his brothers and the nation, but beyond that, his spiritual leadership, his example as the paradigm, the personification of absolute commitment to God in the depths of the exile. And therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu is the one who will personally take it upon himself to fulfill this commitment of his forefathers, that at the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim, make sure to locate the coffin of Yosef and bring him to burial in Eretz Canaan through the Midbar for 40 years until Yeshua would cross the Yarden. And Yosef forever would be an essential, critical part of Knesset Yisrael, reinstated as a paradigm of a Jew who is totally dedicated to the Almighty. And with this, my friends, we end up with Chazak, Chazak, V'nis Chazek. Having concluded Sefer Bereshis, and Amir Hashem will go on to Sefer Shmos. And I want to thank you all for being with us. And it should be a wonderful Shabbos, Parshas VaYechi, and we should be zocher to the fulfillment of all these amazing blessings of Yaakov Avinu for his Shvatim. Keni Ratzon. Amen. Thank you.